Wall Street Wrap-Up is supported by Bamboolas, featuring live music. And now, tapas and wine upstairs. Bamboolas, the heartbeat of Frenchman Street.
This week on Wall Street Wrap-Up, Microsoft did something that it had never done before. We'll tell you what they did. Is America at war with natural gas? We'll tell you of a decision today by the Biden administration that's going to probably make our allies very angry. Boeing's problems are going from bad to worse, from doors flying off in mid-flight to planes on fire while in the air. Boeing CEO Doug Calhoun was in front of Congress this week answering questions such as, what happened to Boeing? I'll bet you saw the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. How a con man, Jordan Belfort, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, swindled thousands of people out of millions of dollars. But what you may not have known is that the movie about a swindler was financed by a real-life swindler who financed by a real-life theft of billions from millions of people, even duping Goldman Sachs in the process. The story is so bizarre, they could make a movie out of it. Oh, wait, they just did. Because tonight, we're going to be with Cassius Michael Kim. He is the writer, producer, and director of the new Netflix movie, Man on the Run. Along with Leo DiCaprio, Paris Hilton, Jamie Foxx, even Britney Spears is popping out of a cake. Truth is stranger than fiction. So hold on to your wallets. A lot to cover for the next 28 minutes. Join us because this is Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi and welcome. I'm Andre Laborde. I hope everyone had a great week. Well, before we begin, an update from last week's show with Bob McNally. Bob is the CEO of Rapidan Energy Group. At the end of our interview, he told us of a major decision that was coming down from the Biden administration affecting the liquefied natural gas, LNG terminal in America, and it's in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana, called Venture Global LNG Refinery. Now, reports are President Biden wants to study the environmental impact, which means it could be indefinitely delayed or canceled all outright. There are 16 other LNG refineries being built or proposed in the U.S., which is coming at a critical time for our allies like Germany, which is desperate for natural gas, as well as other allies in Western Europe. Now, this is following the sabotage of the Nord Sea pipeline in September of 2022. Now, there are suspects, but no clear country responsible for the sabotage yet. Now, make no mistake, if we don't sell countries as Germany, Western Europe, Japan, or even Korea the liquefied natural gas, they'll still buy it. It just won't be getting from us. They'll get it from Russia, which is already making more money than before the Ukrainian invasion. As Bob McNally told us about last week, he mentioned how the Biden administration's embargo was having an opposite effect because now they're selling more oil to China and India and making more money in the process. The Biden administration is trying to pacify the climate environmentalists just before an election. But by not using natural gas as a cleaner fuel, it pushes more people to the burning of coal. Now, no one likes to pay higher interest rates from your credit cards to home loans. The Federal Reserve is going to be meeting next week on Tuesday and on Wednesday to cut rates, hold, or maybe even the possibility of actually raising of higher rates. Most economists are predicting that they're going to hold, with some rate cuts coming later on this year. Today was the last piece of information which the Federal Reserve looks at. It's called the PCE, or the Personal Consumption Expenditure Gauge, and it tracks the prices of goods and services of both the consumer and companies, what they have to pay, and it was down year over year. It's still rising, but not as much as in November. It rose today to 2.9%. So that's next week. But how did our money do this week? Technology was the biggest drag on the markets today, with Intel coming out with less than expected earnings, and Tesla had lower expectations, which the market didn't like. American Express leads the Dow after strong earnings. It was a record high for both Meta, formerly Facebook, and Microsoft. NASDAQ dropped today and broke a 6-day win streak, but ended positive for the week. And this week, the Dow Jones, they closed up 0.6 of a point for the week. The S&P 500, they closed up just over 1% for the week. And the NASDAQ, they closed also up just under 1% for the week. Microsoft this week hit a $3 trillion market cap, surpassing Apple now as the most valuable company. Well, many of you may have seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. It's about Jordan Belfort, a scam artist played by Leo DiCaprio, who steals millions from thousands of people. But what many of you may not know is that the money used to make that movie was all stolen. So how did one guy named Jolo steal billions of dollars from the country of Malaysia to finance a billion-dollar lifestyle, from paying Paris Hilton $100,000 a night to his $250 million super yacht? Cassius Michael Kim is the director, writer, and executive producer of the new Netflix movie, Man on the Run. Hi, Cassius. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Cassius, when it comes to the J-Lo and also one MBD, fund, how long had you followed it before you thought this would make a great movie?
Well, I think it's one of those stories that has been kind of in the zeitgeist here and there because it touches on so many different aspects of our society: Hollywood, Wall Street, international politics. So I think I've been aware of it tangentially for a long time. But it wasn't until I read the book Billion Dollar Whale by Bradley Hope and Tom Wright, two former Wall Street Journal reporters who wrote the kind of compendium on the story that really distills all the various tentacles of the scandal into one digestible book.
Well, I understand what you mean, because we covered it here a few times on our show with Wall Street Wrap-Up. But you wore three hats. You were not only the director, you wrote, and you also were the executive producer. I'm just curious, every one of those would give you a heartache. I mean, which one of the three hats that you wore gave you the most headaches?
Probably the executive producing part. So I think it was just like supervising the production of the film from pre-production to post-production. And because it's an international feature, filming in half a dozen locations around the world.
Cassius, when we talk about the One MBD Fund, what was that?
So the One Malaysia Development Berhad Fund is a sovereign wealth fund. And you might be familiar with sovereign wealth funds around the world. They're popular in the Middle East with nations such as Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and other places that have a lot of excess funds due to oil money, right? So these countries have a lot of money that they invest in a number of things. Saudi Arabia, for example, has Live Golf, and a lot of these other Middle Eastern countries invest in things like English Premier League. A rumor has it that the parking meters in Chicago are owned by the government of Kuwait or something of that nature. So you take excess funds and you create a development fund to invest in infrastructure, invest in projects that will return profits for the country. Now, Malaysia had this idea, but of course, Malaysia, unlike some of these Middle Eastern countries, does not have a large excess amount of funds that can just be invested. So this 1MDB fund was created on the back of debt and nominally to be invested in infrastructure and other things like that. But of course, the main weakness was that it was spending money you didn't have, which was then further exacerbated because that money was then immediately stolen by Jolo and his co-conspirators.
Okay, so now we've got this guy named Jolo. How did he all of a sudden come on the scene and get involved with Malaysia to being able to be an important part of this?
So Jolo is a Malaysian citizen by birth, but he attended school abroad. He attended the Harrow boarding school in England for his secondary education, and Harrow broadly advertises itself as a school where 7 prime ministers have been educated. So, of course, a place where he's meeting and rubbing shoulders with the children of very wealthy people from around the world. And then he completed his bachelor's at the University of Pennsylvania and the Wharton School. he became friends with a man named Riza Aziz, who was the stepson of Najib Razak, who would later become the prime minister of Malaysia. And when this kind of all fell into place, I think Jolo had someone to approach in high levels of Malaysian government with this idea of creating a sovereign wealth fund that he could administer behind the scenes.
Now, as you brought up before, that because Malaysia is more of a poorer country, they had to finance this fund through debt, which is through bonds, through the selling of bonds. So in comes Goldman Sachs. Now, Goldman Sachs is salivating to getting more business in other foreign countries and such. So they were the seller and the purchaser of these bonds.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the relationship Goldman Sachs had with Malaysia is that typically Goldman Sachs facilitates the sale of the bonds, right? They create the marketplace and sell it to clients. But in this case, um, Goldman bought the bonds outright to give a cash infusion to 1MDB and then sold the bonds themselves. So instead of being a middleman, they became the buyer and seller and use that as a reason to charge a fee tenfold of what an investment bank would typically charge a nation for selling those types of bonds. The fee would typically be around 1%, but instead Goldman charged 10%, and it's estimated they made fees upwards of $600 million when these types of transactions would typically result in about a $60 million fee. So a lot of interesting subplots to these transactions.
Under normal circumstances, an investment bank would, because a sovereign, a municipal bond from a city or a county, as also a sovereign bond from a country, because the risks would be lower, it would just be a 1%. But so since Goldman Sachs actually bought the bonds up front, these bonds, whoever holds the bonds now, whether they be individuals or Goldman Sachs, they're not at a loss for this money. Normally, interest is paid on a semi-annual basis, and after, when the bonds mature, then you get this money that you originally put back, whether it be 10 years or whatever. Is someone paying the interest on these bonds as we speak right now?
Yeah, I mean, the burden of accountability has fallen to the Malaysian people. Now, the debt load that Malaysia is responsible for because of interest and all these other charges for fraudulent bond sales exceeds $11 billion. But of course, all these bonds have defaulted, and there's a ton of litigation happening in courts internationally. I think one of the biggest parties is like the Swedish pension fund, which was one of the bigger investors into these fraudulent 1MDB bonds. And they've been involved in litigation with Goldman Sachs for years now.
These bonds are defaulted with Goldman Sachs because they're putting their name to this, and they want to create goodwill because of whether it be Malaysia, Singapore, or other types of countries as this. They wouldn't back these bonds and say that if we sell you these bonds, we've already done, and I'll use the term, our due diligence.
They didn't do their due diligence, and that's why the federal government charged Goldman Sachs a massive fine, upwards of $3 billion for their malfeasance. Now, the bonds themselves were guaranteed by both Malaysia and the United Arab Emirates. But of course, because of malfeasance on both parties, individuals associated with both Malaysia and the UAE were found to have routed these bonds in a fraudulent way. Ultimately, the people left holding the bag are Malaysian citizens and the people that invested in these fraudulent bonds who lost all their money.
Did the people of Malaysia get any money from these bond sales?
I think it's more that Goldman Sachs has been forced to make some of these deficits whole, but of course, the entire hole has not been filled. And it's an ongoing process. And of course, that is why the citizens of Malaysia bear the tax burden of repaying the interest on these lost funds.
The man J-Lo, and also he also had, I think, Najib Razak, who was the prime minister. So what was interesting about Najib was that he was the chairman. He was the chairman of 1MDB. He was also the minister of finance, and he was also the prime minister. But here was the thing: he was that all at one time. Was there was no checks and balances in Malaysia that he wore all these hats?
No, in fact, I think that's what helped kind of grease the wheels because of the entire lack of the checks and balances, which then made the process that much easier to circumvent.
Do you think that, okay, so you had Najib Razak and you have J-Lo. Do you think Najib Razak was recruiting J-Lo to do this? Do you think J-Lo recruited Najib Razak to do this? Or they just,
Just to tell you, it's Jolo, and
oh, J-Lo, I'm sorry. Mhm.
no, sorry, that's I think the biggest mystery in this, right? Like, who is the puppet and who is the puppet
Mhm.
master? Now, clearly, Najib Razak enabled Jolo and his cronies and his co-conspirators to actuate and execute this fraud. That Jolo was the mastermind of the machinations behind the actual fraud, and the prime minister was willing to look the other way as long as his pockets were padded and his wife was bought Birkin bags and pink diamonds from around the globe.
That's a good
Uh,
that's a good point too, Cassius, because his wife certainly, I'm talking about Najib's wife, was also partaking. She spent very lavishly on the money that was coming in, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tales of Rosman Mansour's spending are urban legend in Malaysia and beyond in Southeast Asia. One of the first ladies, quote unquote, that puts Imelda Marcos and her shoe obsession to shame.
Uh-huh.
I've heard it.
Yeah.
But there is one legendary shopping trip in Hawaii where Najib Razak had his private plane diverted in between global meetings with other heads of state. And they reputedly bought out every luxury store of every luxury good on a epic shopping spree numbering in the millions of dollars in that one time.
So, okay, so Jolo. Normally, when somebody, I would assume, embezzles money, you want to keep quiet. You want to fly under the radar. But Jolo did something just the opposite. He went off and financed a movie. He went off and wanted to hobnob with celebrities. Tell me about the relationship between Jolo and getting involved with the Wolf of Wall Street.
So I think, as mentioned previously, Jolo figured out early on that life is very much in part about who you know, especially when you're trying to become
Hmm.
an international businessman. So there was a method to the madness in that he would pay celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio, Jamie Foxx, Britney Spears, etc. He would pay these celebrities six-figure sums a night to hang out and party with himself and his friends. Now, obviously, this looks good to certain kinds of people who you want to invest in your ventures. And Jolo definitely had his fingers in a lot of different ventures. At one point he had agreed to buy Reebok and the Park Lane Hotel, as well as a subsidiary of the Universal Music Group. So he's constantly throwing lavish parties and fundraisers and charitable events. And he's paying these A-list celebrities to be part of his crew. At a certain point, when you're stealing billions of dollars, you have to figure out how to launder that money. And making a film is probably a great way to launder money, or at least have
Yeah,
somewhere you can dump
yeah.
all kinds of money. I mean, I remember hearing that there's a famous scene in The Wolf of Wall Street where Jordan Belfort, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, crashes his Lamborghini sports car. And typically in a Hollywood production, to save money, they would use a replica of that sports car to crash it because it's going to be destroyed. But with Jolo, there was a blank check, and they're like, no, 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 just get the actual thing, and we'll crash it on screen. It's fine. As you mentioned, when you do these kind of crimes, the trick is to keep it hidden
Yeah.
or to make it sustainable in some way. So someone like Bernie Madoff, even
Hmm.
who perpetuated his fraud for decades, you take in money with one hand and you disperse it with the other, and then you know, take some off the top to make sure you can perpetuate this fraud. So Goldman Sachs did three bond sales, right, separated by a period of several months in between each bond sales, and with each bond sale, there's a cash influx. So Jolo has opportunities to fill the missing coffers of 1MDB to perpetuate the fraud longer. But instead of doing that, this guy's going out and buying a $250 million super yacht, even when the mainstream media is now publishing stories about your purported fraud and people are investigating 1MDB within Malaysia and beyond. At a time when you would think he would take a step back, he did the opposite.
Is it true that for Jolo's birthday party, he had all those who went to his birthday party sign an NDA? And for, by the way, our viewers, an NDA is a non-disclosure agreement, so it's sort of like Las Vegas. What goes on there stays there. He had people sign it?
Yeah, and it actually did take place in Las Vegas. He rented
Oh,
an
it
empty
was? I
lot.
didn't even know that. Okay. That was just,
Everyone had to sign an NDA, and you had to drop your phones off. Like when you go to a concert sometimes, and they take your phones at the gate, where he purportedly paid Britney Spears $1 million to jump out of a fake birthday cake and sing happy birthday to him.
now, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I do play one on television, okay? But it seems to me that Jolo, I would assume that, and I don't mean this to sound mean, but what the heck? We're talking about an embezzler, right? Okay, he probably didn't have many dates in high school. Now, all of a sudden, he's got over $1 billion stolen, but over $1 billion. He's got a $250 million super yacht, and he can have Britney Spears jump out of a cake, and he hangs around with Leo DiCaprio. So he's thinking that he's feeling pretty good.
Well, I think the human element can't be discounted.
There's a book called The Count of Monte Cristo that also became a movie. And Edmond Dantes was the character who was a poor guy who turns into the Count of Monte Cristo. And what was it about that character and the movie and Jolo?
I think it's just that metaphor of the person who can be the puppet master. And I think that's also why he's referred to oftentimes as the Asian Great Gatsby in some circles, because it was this kind of obsession, I think, with accruing status. But then again, there's those videos of him popping bottles with Britney Spears, and I'm sorry, Paris Hilton, rather, that's in the film. And I've spoken with people who were with him in Saint Tropez when he dropped, I think, like $4 million on magnums of Cristal in one evening. So I don't want to paint this guy to be some kind of monk or teetotaler. He's clearly reveling in the party. But to what end, I think, is a real mystery.
Can you, the billions that he still has, and by the way, for our viewers, he's still on the run. He can't, they don't have him yet. You can't carry something like that kind of money in the suitcase. So what kind of, whether it be Interpol or banking investigations, how is it that they can't find or trace the money?
I think there's just been a lot of disbursement, right? I think one of the most interesting things about this scandal to me was when you trace the outward impact is just the web of people who received funds, who benefited from the scandal. And in that way, you launder the money. And I've spoken to investigative journalist friends of mine who tell me that in any large scale project, even to this day, that requires large cash infusions, you will find 1MDB money as part of that. And same for Jolo. I think that's why he's hiding in China and being protected by the CCP. He knows where the bodies are buried, and things he knows could put a lot of people at risk, at shame. But how long that utility that he possesses lasts to the Chinese government, I suppose that's something we won't find out until it's all kind of gone and past.
Well, in the United States, there's a law called RICO, and RICO is like Racketeering, Influence, Corrupt Organization Act. Basically, any ill-gotten money that was used for other things, that money could basically be clawed back. So I'm curious, like the money that the Wolf of Wall Street made, or $250,000 a day that Leo DiCaprio was paid, or $100,000 a day that Paris Hilton was paid, or like you said, $1 million for Britney to jump out of a cake. I mean, can any of that be clawed back?
Yeah, and in fact, most of these celebrities, I'm pretty sure, have returned that money to the extent that it was returnable, right? Because not everyone's kind of keeping track of how many nights you're hanging out with Jolo over the years, right? But in addition to the nightly charges, Jolo at a certain point invested tens of millions of dollars in art. as another way of laundering money, and he gifted Leonardo DiCaprio, Picasso, and a Basquiat painting, as well as Marlon Brando's long lost Oscar statue for On the Waterfront. And a lot of these kinds of items were returned to the federal government, and the federal government did work out a repayment program for any gross net receipts for the Wolf of Wall Street, and residuals that may come in. They're routed to the country of Malaysia. Same for the super yacht, which was ultimately seized in Southeast Asia several years after the conclusion of the scandal, and then given back to the Malaysian government. Now, as you can imagine, upkeep on a $250 million super yacht is exorbitantly expensive. So the government of Malaysia had to sell the yacht, the secondhand market, at a huge loss. So there have been efforts with what they've been able to claw back, but of course, it's never going to make that initial fraud whole.
Well, Cassius, I have to say, if I'm paying $250,000 for Leo DiCaprio or $100,000 to Paris Hilton, I want them more than just for the night. They have to be there with me during the day too, and I want them to clock in, so I'll be paying them by the hour. The movie is called Man on the Run. It's a great film. It's on Netflix. And Cassius, thank you for being with us. I hope you have much success with it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It was great to speak with you.
Thanks, Cassius. Hey, if you've got a question, maybe a comment about the show, we'd love to hear from you. Make it concise, make it pithy, and write us at andre@benacapital.com. So now, let's take a wrap up on Wall Street. Well, this week, Boeing CEO Doug Calhoun was being grilled on Capitol Hill about Boeing jets. And Boeing's problems are now going from bad to worse, from having their doors flying off in mid-flight to now having loose bolts found in other Alaskan Air and United jets made by Boeing. And Boeing CEO Doug Calhoun admits mistakes were made as investigators are probing doors flying off in the midair. Well, this week, a Boeing cargo jet in mid-flight had to make an emergency landing after catching on fire on what was now called an engine malfunction. So if you're thinking about flying and about to fly and wondering how many more loose bolts are yet to be found and just how friendly are the friendly skies, you don't want to miss next week. Our guest next week when we talk to Mike Boyd. Mike is president and CEO of Boyd Group International and is an expert on commercial aviation. And that's a wrap-up on Wall Street Wrap-Up. Our thanks to Cassius Kim for being with us tonight. But as always, we appreciate you for allowing us into your homes this evening. Have a fun weekend with the ones you love. Remember, if it's Friday, it's Wall Street Wrap-Up. I'm Andre Laborde. And also remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Wall Street Wrap-Up is supported by Bamboolas, featuring live music. And now, tapas and wine upstairs. Bamboolas, the heartbeat of Frenchman Street.